The Dragon and His Grandmother by Andrew Lang. There was once a great war, and the king had a great many soldiers, but he gave them so little pay that they could not live upon it. Then three of them took counsel together and determined to desert. One of them said to the others, "If we are caught, we shall be hanged on the gallows. How shall we set about it?" The other said, "Do you see that large cornfield there? If we were to hide ourselves in that, no one could find us, the army cannot come into it. And tomorrow it is to march on." They crept into the corn, but the army did not march on, but remained encamped close around them. They sat for 2 days and 2 nights in the corn, and grew so hungry that they nearly died. But if they were to venture out, it was certain death. They said at last, "What use was it our deserting? We must perish here miserably." Whilst they were speaking, a fiery dragon came flying through the air. It hovered near them, and asked why they were hidden there. They answered, "We are three soldiers, and have deserted because our pay was so small now. If we remain here, we shall die of hunger. And if we move out, we shall be strung up on the gallows." "If you will serve me for 7 years," said the dragon, "I will lead you through the midst of the army, so that no one shall catch you. We have no choice, and must take your offer," said they. Then the dragon seized them in his claws, took them through the air over the army, and set them down on the earth a long way from it. He gave them a little whip, saying, "Whip and slash with this, and as much money as you want will jump up before you. You can then live as great lords, keep horses, and drive about in carriages. But after 7 years you are mine." Then he put a book before them, which he made all three of them sign. "I will then give you a riddle," he said. "If you guess it, you shall be free and out of my power." The dragon then flew away, and they journeyed on with their little whip. They had as much money as they wanted, wore grand clothes, and made their way into the world. Wherever they went, they lived in merrymaking and splendor, drove about with horses and carriages, ate and drank, but did nothing wrong. The time passed quickly away, and when the 7 years were nearly ended, two of them grew terribly anxious and frightened. But the third made light of it, saying, "Don't be afraid, brothers, I wasn't born yesterday. I will guess the riddle." They went into a field, sat down, and the two pulled long faces. An old woman passed by, and asked them why they were so sad. "Alas, what have you to do with it? You cannot help us." "Who knows?" she answered. "Only confide your trouble in me." Then they told her that they had become the servants of the dragon for 7 long years, and how he had given them money as plentifully as blackberries. But as they had signed their names, they were his unless, when the 7 years had passed, they could guess a riddle. The old woman said, "If you would help yourselves, one of you must go into the wood, and there he will come upon a tumble-down building of rocks, which looks like a little house. He must go in, and there he will find help." The two melancholy ones thought, "That won't save us," and they remained where they were. But the third and merry one jumped up and went into the wood, till he found the rock hut. In the hut sat a very old woman who was the dragon's grandmother. She asked him how he came, and what was his business there. He told her all that happened, and because she was pleased with him, she took compassion on him, and said she would help him. She lifted up a large stone, which lay over the cellar, saying, "Hide yourself. There you can hear all that is spoken in this room. Only sit still, and don't stir. When the dragon comes, I will ask him what the riddle is, for he tells me everything. Then listen carefully what he answers." At midnight the dragon flew in and asked for his supper. His grandmother laid the table and brought out food and drink, till he was satisfied, and they ate and drank together. Then, in the course of the conversation, she asked him what he had done in the day, and how many souls he had conquered. "I haven't had much luck today," he said, "but I have a tight hold on 3 soldiers." "Indeed, 3 soldiers," said she, "who cannot escape you." "They are mine," answered the dragon scornfully, "for I shall only give them one riddle which they will never be able to guess." "What sort of a riddle is it?" she asked. "I will tell you this: in the North Sea lies a dead secret that shall be their roast meat, and the rib of a wallet that shall be their silver spoon, and the hollow foot of a dead horse that shall be their wineglass." When the dragon had gone to bed, his old grandmother pulled up the stone and let out the soldier. "Did you pay attention to everything?" "Yes," he replied, "I know enough, and can help myself splendidly." Then he went by another way through the window secretly, and in all haste back to his comrades. He told them how the dragon had been outwitted by his grandmother, and how he had heard from his own lips the answer to the riddle. Then they were all delighted, and in high spirits took out their whip and cracked so much money that it came jumping up from the ground. When the 7 years had quite gone, the fiend came with his book, and pointing at the signatures said, "I will take you underground with me. You shall have a meal there, if you can tell me what you will get for your roast meat. You shall be free, and shall also keep the whip." Then said the first soldier in the North Sea, lies a dead sea cat that shall be the roast meat. The dragon was much annoyed and hummed, and hawed a good deal, and asked the second, but what shall be your spoon? The rib of a whale shall be our silver spoon. The dragon made a face and growled again 3 times hum hum hum, and said to the third, do you know what your wineglass shall be? An old horse's hoof shall be our wineglass. Then the dragon flew away with a loud shriek, and had no more power over them. But the 3 soldiers took the little whip, whipped as much money as they wanted, and lived happily to their lives' end. The donkey cabbage. There was once a young hunter who went boldly into the forest. He had a merry and light heart. And as he went whistling along, there came an ugly old woman who said to him, good day, dear hunter. You are very merry and contented, but I suffer hunger and thirst, so give me a trifle. The hunter was sorry for the poor old woman, and he felt in his pocket, and gave her all he could spare. He was going on then. But the old woman stopped him, and said, listen, dear hunter, to what I say, because of your kind heart. I will make you a present, go on your way, and in a short time you will come to a tree on which sit 9 birds who have a cloak in their claws, and are quarreling over it. Then take aim with your gun and shoot in the middle of them. They will let the cloak fall, but one of the birds will be hit, and will drop down dead. Take the cloak with you. It is a wishing cloak, and when you throw it on your shoulders, you have only to wish yourself at a certain place. And in the twinkling of an eye you are there. Take the heart out of the dead bird, and swallow it whole, and early every morning, when you get up, you will find a gold piece under your pillow. The hunter thanked the wise woman and thought to himself, these are splendid things she has promised me, if only they come to pass. So he walked on about 100 yards, and then he heard above him in the branches such a screaming and chirping that he looked up. And there he saw a heap of birds tearing a cloth with their beaks, and feet shrieking, tugging, and fighting, as if each wanted it for himself. Well, said the hunter, this is wonderful. It is just as the old woman said. And he took his gun on his shoulder, pulled the trigger, and shot into the midst of them, so that their feathers flew about. Then the flock took flight with much screaming, but one fell dead. And the cloak fluttered down. Then the hunter did as the old woman had told him. He cut open the bird, found its heart, swallowed it, and took the cloak home with him. The next morning, when he awoke, he remembered the promise and wanted to see if it had come true. But when he lifted up his pillow, there sparkled the gold piece, and the next morning he found another. And so, on every time he got up, he collected a heap of gold. But at last he thought to himself, what good is all my gold to me if I stay at home? I will travel and look a bit about me in the world. So he took leave of his parents, slung his hunting knapsack and his gun round him, and journeyed into the world. It happened that one day he went through a thick wood, and when he came to the end of it, there lay in the plain before him a large castle. At one of the windows in it stood an old woman with a most beautiful maiden by her side, looking out. But the old woman was a witch, and she said to the girl, there comes one out of the wood who has a wonderful treasure in his body, which we must manage to possess ourselves of. Darling daughter, we have more right to it than he has a bird's heart in him. And so every morning there lies a gold piece under his pillow. She told her how they could get hold of it, and how she was to coax it from him, and at last threatened her angrily, saying, and if you do not obey me, you shall repent it. When the hunter came nearer, he saw the maiden, and said to himself, I have traveled so far now that I will rest and turn into this beautiful castle. Money I have in plenty. But the real reason was that he had caught sight of the lovely face. He went into the house and was kindly received and hospitably entertained. It was not long before he was so much in love with the witch maiden that he thought of nothing else and only looked in her eyes. And whatever she wanted, that he gladly. Roman 999. Then the old witch said, now we must have the bird heart he will not feel when it is gone. She prepared a drink, and when it was ready she poured it in a goblet, and gave it to the maiden, who had to hand it to the hunter. Drink to me now, my dearest, she said. Then he took the goblet, and when he had swallowed the drink, the bird heart came out of his mouth. The maiden had to get hold of it secretly, and then swallow it herself, for the old witch wanted to have it thenceforward. He found no more gold under his pillow, and it lay under the maiden's, but he was so much in love, and so much bewitched, that he thought of nothing except spending all his time with the maiden. Then the old witch said, we have the bird heart, but we must also get the wishing cloak from him. The maiden answered, we will leave him, that he has already lost his wealth. The old witch grew angry, and said, such a cloak is a wonderful thing, it is seldom to be had in the world, and have it I must. And will she beat the maiden, and said that if she did not obey it would go ill with her. So she did her mother's bidding, and standing one day by the window, she looked away into the far distance as if she were very sad. Why are you standing there looking so sad? Asked the hunter. "Alas, my love," she replied, "over there lies the granite mountain, where the costly precious stones grow. I have a great longing to go there so that, when I think of it, I am very sad, for who can fetch them? Only the birds who fly, a man never." "If you have no other trouble," said the hunter, "that one I can easily remove from your heart." So he wrapped her round in his cloak and wished themselves to the granite mountain, and in an instant there they were sitting on it. The precious stones sparkled so brightly on all sides that it was a pleasure to see them, and they collected the most beautiful and costly together. But now, the old witch had through her caused the hunter's eyes to become heavy. He said to the maiden, "We will sit down for a little while, and rest. I am so tired that I can hardly stand on my feet." So they sat down, and he laid his head on her lap and fell asleep as soon as he was sound asleep. She unfastened the cloak from his shoulders, threw it on her own, left the granite and stones, and wished herself home again. But when the hunter had finished his sleep and awoke, he found that his love had betrayed him, and left him alone on the wild mountain. "Oh," said he, "why is faithlessness so great in the world?" And he sat down in sorrow and trouble, not knowing what to do. But the mountain belonged to fierce and huge giants who lived on it, and traded there. And he had not sat long before he saw three of them striding towards him, so he lay down as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. The giants came up, and the first pushed him with his foot, and said, "What sort of an earthworm is that?" The second said, "Crush him dead." But the third said contemptuously, "It is not worth the trouble, let him live, he cannot remain here, and if he goes higher up the mountain, the clouds will take him and carry him off." Talking thus they went away, but the hunter had listened to their talk. And as soon as they had gone he rose, and climbed to the summit. When he had sat there a little while, a cloud swept by, and seizing him carried him away. It traveled for a time in the sky, and then it sank down and hovered over a large vegetable garden, surrounded by walls, so that he came safely to the ground, amidst cabbages and vegetables. The hunter then looked about him, saying, "If only I had something to eat, I am so hungry, and it will go badly with me in the future. For I see here not an apple or pear or fruit of any kind, nothing, but vegetables everywhere." At last he thought, "At a pinch I can eat a salad. It does not taste particularly nice, but it will refresh me." So he looked about for a good head and ate it, but no sooner had he swallowed a couple of mouthfuls than he felt very strange, and found himself wonderfully changed. 4 legs began to grow on him, a thick head, and 2 long ears, and he saw with horror that he had changed into a donkey. But as he was still very hungry, and this juicy salad tasted very good to his present nature, he went on eating with a still greater appetite. At last, he got hold of another kind of cabbage, but scarcely had swallowed it when he felt another change, and he once more regained his human form. The hunter now lay down and slept off his weariness. When he awoke the next morning, he broke off a head of the bad and a head of the good cabbage, thinking, "This will help me to regain my own, and to punish faithlessness." Then he put the heads in his pockets, climbed the wall, and started off to seek the castle of his love. When he had wandered about for a couple of days, he found it quite easily. He then browned his face quickly, so that his own mother would not have known him, and went into the castle, where he begged for a lodging. "I am so tired," he said, "I can go no farther." The witch asked, "Countryman, who are you, and what is your business?" He answered, "I am a messenger of the king, and have been sent to seek the finest salad that grows under the sun. I have been so lucky as to find it, and am bringing it with me. But the heat of the sun is so great that the tender cabbage threatens to grow soft, and I do not know if I shall be able to bring it any farther." When the old witch heard of the fine salad, she wanted to eat it, and said, "Dear countryman, just let me taste the wonderful salad." "Why not?" he answered, "I have brought 2 heads with me, and will give you one." So saying, he opened his sack, and gave her the bad one. The witch suspected no evil, and her mouth watered to taste the new dish, so that she went into the kitchen to prepare it herself. When it was ready, she could not wait till it was served at the table, but she immediately took a couple of leaves, and put them in her mouth. No sooner, however, had she swallowed them than she lost human form, and ran into the courtyard in the shape of a donkey. Now the servant came into the kitchen, and when she saw the salad standing there ready cooked, she was about to carry it up. But on the way, according to her old habit, she tasted it, and ate a couple of leaves. Immediately the charm worked, and she became a donkey, and ran out to join the old witch, and the dish with the salad in it fell to the ground. In the meantime, the messenger was sitting with the lovely maiden, and as no one came with the salad, and she wanted very much to taste it, she said, "I don't know where the salad is." Then thought the hunter the cabbage must have already begun to work, and he said, "I will go to the kitchen and fetch it myself." When he came there, he saw the 2 donkeys running about in the courtyard, but the salad was lying on the ground. That's all right, said he too have had their share, and lifting the remaining leaves up, he laid them on the dish and brought them to the maiden. I am bringing you the delicious food my own self, he said, so that you need not wait any longer. Then she ate, and as the others had done, she at once lost her human form and ran as a donkey into the yard. When the hunter had washed his face so that the changed ones might know him, he went into the yard, saying, "Now, you shall receive a reward for your faithlessness." He tied them all three with a rope and drove them away till he came to a Roman 1099. He knocked at the window, and the miller put his head out and asked what he wanted. "I have 3 tiresome animals," he answered, "which I don't want to keep any longer. If you will take them, give them food and stabling, and do as I tell you with them, I will pay you as much as you want." The miller replied, "Why not? What shall I do with them?" Then the hunter said that to the old donkey, which was the witch 3 beatings and 1 meal, to the younger one, which was the servant 1 beating and 3 meals, and to the youngest one, which was the maiden, no beating and 3 meals, for he could not find it in his heart to let the maiden be beaten. Then he went back into the castle, and he found there all that he wanted. After a couple of days, the miller came, and said that he must tell him that the old donkey, which was to have 3 beatings, and only 1 meal, had died. The 2 others, he added, are certainly not dead, and get their 3 meals every day, but they are so sad that they cannot last much longer. Then the hunter took pity on them, laid aside his anger, and told the miller to drive them back again. And when they came, he gave them some of the good cabbage to eat, so that they became human again. Then the beautiful maiden fell on her knees before him, saying, "Oh, my dearest, forgive me. The ill I have done you, my mother compelled me. To do it, it was against my will, for I love you dearly. Your wishing cloak is hanging in a cupboard. And as for the bird heart, I will make a drink and give it back to you." But he changed his mind, and said, "Keep it. It makes no difference, for I will take you to be my own dear true wife." And the wedding was celebrated, and they lived happy together till death. The little green frog ate. In a part of the world whose name I forget lived once upon a time 2 kings called Peridor and Diamantino. They were cousins as well as neighbors, and both were under the protection of the fairies. Though it is only fair to say that the fairies did not love them half so well as their wives, Roman 999. Now, it often happens that as princes can generally manage to get their own way, it is harder for them to be good than it is for common people. So it was with Peridor and Diamantino. But of the 2, the fairies declared that Diamantino was much the worst indeed. He behaved so badly to his wife Eglantino that the fairies would not allow him to live any longer. And he died, leaving behind him a little daughter, as she was an only child, of course. This little girl was the heiress of the kingdom. But being still only a baby, her mother, the widow of Diamantino, was proclaimed regent. The Queen Dowager was wise and good, and tried her best to make her people happy. The only thing she had to vex her was the absence of her daughter, for the fairies, for reasons of their own, determined to bring up the little Princess Serpentine among themselves. As to the other king, he was really fond of his wife Queen Constance, but he often grieved her by his thoughtless ways, and in order to punish him for his carelessness, the fairies caused her to die quite suddenly. When she was gone, the king felt how much he had loved her, and his grief was so great, though he never neglected his duties, that his subjects called him Peridor the Sorrowful. It seems hardly possible that any man should live like Peridor for 15 years, plunged in such depth of grief. And most likely he would have died too if it had not been for the fairies. The one comfort the poor king had was his son Prince Saphir, who was only 3 years old at the time of his mother's death, and great care was given to his education. By the time he was 15, Saphir had learnt everything that a prince should know, and he was besides charming and agreeable. It was about this time that the fairies suddenly took fright, lest his love for his father should interfere with the plans they had made for the young prince. So, to prevent this, they placed, in a pretty little room of which Saphir was very fond, a little mirror in a black frame, such as were often brought from Venice. The prince did not notice for some days that there was anything new in the room, but at last he perceived it, and went up to look at it more closely. What was his surprise to see reflected in the mirror not his own face, but that of a young girl as lovely as the morning, and better still, every movement of the girl just growing out of childhood was also reflected in the wonderful glass. As might have been expected, the young prince lost his heart completely to the beautiful image, and it was impossible to get him out of the room, so busy was he in watching the lovely unknown. Certainly, it was very delightful to be able to see her, whom he loved at any moment he chose, but his spirits sometimes sank when he wondered what was to be the end of this adventure. The magic mirror had been for about a year in the prince's possession, when one day a new subject of disquiet seized upon him. As usual, he was engaged in looking at the girl, when suddenly, he thought he saw a second mirror reflected in the first exactly like his own, and with the same power. And in this he was perfectly right. The young girl had only possessed it for a short time, and neglected all her duties for the sake of the mirror now. It was not difficult for Saphir to guess the reason of the change in her, nor why the new mirror was consulted so often, but try as he would, he could never see the face of the person who was reflected in it. For the young girl's figure always came between. All he knew was that the face was that of a man, and this was quite enough to make him madly jealous. This was the doing of the fairies, and we must suppose that they had their reasons for acting as they Roman 999. When these things happened, Saphir was about 18 years old, and 15 years had passed away since the death of his mother. King Peridor had grown more and more unhappy as time went on, and at last he fell so ill that it seemed as if his days were numbered. He was so much beloved by his subjects that this sad news was heard with despair by the nation, and more than all by the prince. During his whole illness, the king never spoke of anything but the queen, his sorrow at having grieved her, and his hope of one day seeing her again. All the doctors and all the water cures in the kingdom had been tried, and nothing would do him any good at last. He persuaded them to let him lie quietly in his room, where no one came to trouble him. Perhaps the worst pain he had to bear was a sort of weight on his chest, which made it very hard for him to breathe. So he commanded his servants to leave the windows open in order that he might get more air. One day, when he had been left alone for a few minutes, a bird with brilliant plumage came and fluttered round the window, and finally rested on the sill. His feathers were sky blue, and gold his feet, and his beak of such glittering rubies that no one could bear to look at them. His eyes made the brightest diamonds look dull, and on his head he wore a crown. I cannot tell you what the crown was made of, but I am quite certain that it was still more splendid than all the rest. As to his voice, I can say nothing about that, for the bird never sang at all. In fact, he did nothing but gaze steadily at the king, and as he gazed, the king felt his strength come back to him. In a little while, the bird flew into the room, still with his eyes fixed on the king, and at every glance the strength of the sick man became greater, till he was once more as well as he used to be before the queen died. Filled with joy at his cure, he tried to seize the bird to whom he owed it all, but swifter than a swallow, it managed to avoid him. In vain he described the bird to his attendants, who rushed at his first call. In vain they sought the wonderful creature both on horse and foot, and summoned the fowlers to their aid. The bird could nowhere be found. The love the people bore King Peridor was so strong, and the reward he promised was so large, that in the twinkling of an eye every man, woman, and child had fled into the fields, and the towns were quite empty. All this bustle, however, ended in nothing but confusion, and what was worse, the king soon fell back into the same condition as he was in before. Prince Saphir, who loved his father very dearly, was so unhappy at this that he persuaded himself that he might succeed where the others had failed, and at once prepared himself for a more distant search. In spite of the opposition he met with, he rode away, followed by his household, trusting to chance to help him. He had formed no plan, and there was no reason that he should choose one path more than another. His only idea was to make straight for those spots which were the favorite haunts of birds. But in vain he examined all the hedges and all the thickets. In vain he questioned everyone he met along the road. The more he sought, the less he found. At last he came to one of the largest forests in all the world, composed entirely of cedars. But in spite of the deep shadows cast by the wide-spreading branches of the trees, the grass underneath was soft and green, and covered with the rarest flowers. It seemed to Saphir that this was exactly the place where the birds would choose to live, and he determined not to quit the wood until he had examined it from end to end. And he did more. He ordered some nets to be prepared and painted of the same colors as the bird's plumage, thinking that we are all easily caught by what is like ourselves in this. He had to help him not only the fowlers by profession, but also his attendants who excelled in this art, for a man is not a courtier unless he can do everything. After searching as usual for nearly a whole day, Prince Saphir began to feel overcome with thirst. He was too tired to go any farther when happily he discovered a little way off a bubbling fountain of the clearest water. Being an experienced traveler, he drew from his pocket a little cup without which no one should ever take a journey, and was just about to dip it in the water when a lovely little green frog, much prettier than frogs generally are, jumped into the cup. Far from admiring its beauty, Saphir shook it impatiently off. But it was no good, for quick as lightning the frog jumped back again. Saphir, who was raging with thirst, was just about to shake it off anew when the little creature fixed upon him the most beautiful eyes in the world, and said, "I am a friend of the bird you are seeking, and when you have quenched your thirst, listen to me." So the prince drank his fill, and then by the command of the little green frog, he lay down on the grass to rest himself. Now she began, "Be sure you do exactly in every respect what I tell you first. You must call together your attendants, and order them to remain in a little hamlet close by. Until you want them, then go quite alone down a road that you will find on your right hand looking southwards. This road is planted all the way with cedars of Lebanon, and after going down it, a long way you will come at last to a magnificent castle. And now," she went on, "attend carefully to what I am going to say. Take this tiny grain of sand and put it into the ground as close as you can to the gate of the castle. It has the virtue both of opening the gate and also of sending to sleep all the inhabitants. Then go at once to the stable, and pay no heed to anything except what I tell you. Choose the handsomest of all the horses, leap quickly on its back, and come to me as fast as you can. Farewell, prince, I wish you good luck." And with these words the little frog plunged into the water and disappeared. The prince, who felt more hopeful than he had done since he left home, did precisely as he had been ordered. He left his attendants in the hamlet, found the road the frog had described to him, and followed it all alone, and at last he arrived at the gate of the castle, which was even more splendid than he had expected, for it was built of crystal, and all its ornaments were of massive gold. However, he had no thoughts to spare for its beauty, and quickly buried his grain of sand in the earth. In one instant, the gates flew open, and all the dwellers inside fell sound asleep. Saphir flew straight to the stable, and already had his hand on the finest horse it contained, when his eye was caught by a suit of magnificent harness hanging up close by. It occurred to him directly that the harness belonged to the horse, and without ever thinking of harm, for indeed he who steals a horse can hardly be blamed for taking his saddle, he hastily placed it on the animal's back. Suddenly the people in the castle became broad awake and rushed to the stable. They flung themselves on the prince, seized him, and dragged him before their lord. But luckily for the prince, who could only find very lame excuses for his conduct, the lord of the castle took a fancy to his face and let him depart without further questions. Very sad and very much ashamed of himself, poor Saphir crept back to the fountain, where the frog was awaiting him with a good scolding. "Whom do you take me for?" she exclaimed angrily. "Do you really believe that it was just for the pleasure of talking that I gave you the advice you have neglected so abominably?" But the prince was so deeply grieved and apologized so very humbly that after some time the heart of the good little frog was softened, and she gave him another tiny little grain. But instead of being sand, it was now a grain of gold. She directed him to do just as he had done before, with only this difference, that instead of going to the stable, which had been the ruin of his hopes, he was to enter right into the castle itself, and to glide as fast as he could down the passages, till he came to a room filled with perfume, where he would find a beautiful maiden asleep on a bed. He was to wake the maiden instantly, and carry her off, and to be sure not to pay any heed to whatever resistance she might make. The prince obeyed the frog's orders one by one, and all went well for this second time. Also the gate opened, the inhabitants fell sound asleep, and he walked down the passage till he found the girl on her bed exactly as he had been told he would. He woke her and begged her firmly but politely to follow him quickly. After a little persuasion, the maiden consented, but only on condition that she was allowed first to put on her dress. This sounded so reasonable and natural that it did not enter the prince's head to refuse her request. But the maiden's hand had hardly touched the dress when the palace suddenly awoke from its sleep, and the prince was seized and bound. He was so vexed with his own folly, and so taken aback at the disaster, that he did not attempt to explain his conduct, and things would have gone badly with him if his friends, the fairies, had not softened the hearts of his captors, so that they once more allowed him to leave quietly. However, what troubled him most was the idea of having to meet the frog who had been his benefactress. How was he ever to appear before her with this tale? Still, after a long struggle with himself, he made up his mind that there was nothing else to be done, and that he deserved whatever she might say to him, and she said a great deal, for she had worked herself into a terrible passion. But the prince humbly implored her pardon, and ventured to point out that it would have been very hard to refuse the young lady's reasonable request. "You must learn to do as you are told," was all the frog would reply. But poor Saphir was so unhappy, and begged so hard for forgiveness, that at last the frog's anger gave way, and she held up to him a tiny diamond stone. "Go back," she said, "to the castle, and bury this little diamond close to the door, but be careful not to return to the stable or to the bedroom. They have proved too fatal to you. Walk straight to the garden, and enter through a portico into a small green wood, in the midst of which is a tree with a trunk of gold and leaves of emeralds, perched on this tree, you will see the beautiful bird you have been seeking so long. You must cut the branch on which it is sitting, and bring it back to me without delay. But I warn you solemnly that if you disobey my directions, as you have done twice, before you have nothing more to expect either of me or anyone else. With these words, she jumped into the water, and the prince, who had taken her threats much to heart, took his departure, firmly resolved not to deserve them. He found it all just as he had been told: the portico, the wood, the magnificent tree, and the beautiful bird which was sleeping soundly on one of the branches. He speedily lopped off the branch, and though he noticed a splendid golden cage hanging close by which would have been very useful for the bird to travel, and he left it alone, and came back to the fountain holding his breath and walking on tiptoe all the way for fear lest he should awake his prize. But what was his surprise when, instead of finding the fountain in the spot where he had left it, he saw in its place a little rustic palace built in the best taste, and standing in the doorway, a charming maiden at whose sight his mind seemed to give way. "What, madam?" he cried, hardly knowing what he said. "What is it, you?" The maiden blushed and answered, "Ah, my lord, it is long since I first beheld your face, but I did not think you had ever seen mine." "Oh, madam," replied he, "you can never guess the days and the hours I have passed lost in admiration of you." And after these words, they each related all the strange things that had happened, and the more they talked, the more they felt convinced of the truth of the images they had seen in their mirrors. After some time spent in the most tender conversation, the prince could not restrain himself from asking the lovely unknown by what lucky chance she was wandering in the forest where the fountain had gone, and if she knew anything of the frog to whom he owed all his happiness, and to whom he must give up the bird which somehow or other was still sound asleep. "Ah, my lord," she replied with rather an awkward air, "as to the frog, she stands before you. Let me tell you my story. It is not a long one. I know neither my country nor my parents, and the only thing I can say for certain is that I am called Serpentine. The fairies who have taken care of me ever since I was born wished me to be in ignorance as to my family, but they have looked after my education and have bestowed on me endless kindness. I have always lived in seclusion, and for the last 2 years I have wished for nothing better. I had a mirror." Her shyness and embarrassment choked her words, but regaining her self-control, she added, "You know that fairies insist on being obeyed without questioning. It was they who changed the little house you saw before you into the fountain, for which you are now asking. And having turned me into a frog, they ordered me to say to the first person who came to the fountain exactly what I repeated to you. But, my lord, when you stood before me, it was agony to my heart filled, as it was with thoughts of you, to appear to your eyes under so monstrous a form. However, there was no help for it, and painful as it was, I had to submit. I desired your success with all my soul, not only for your own sake, but also for my own, because I could not get back my proper shape till you had become master of the beautiful bird, though I am quite ignorant as to your reason for seeking it." On this, Saphir explained about the state of his father's health and all that has been told before. On hearing this story, Serpentine grew very sad, and her lovely eyes filled with tears. "Ah, my lord," she said, "you know nothing of me but what you have seen in the mirror, and I, who cannot even name my parents, learn that you are a king's son." In vain Saphir declared that love made them equal. Serpentine would only reply, "I love you too much to allow you to marry beneath your rank. I shall be very unhappy, of course, but I shall never alter my mind. If I do not find from the fairies that my birth is worthy of you, then, whatever be my feelings, I will never accept your hand." The conversation was at this point and bid fair to last some time longer, when one of the fairies appeared in her ivory car, accompanied by a beautiful woman, past her early youth. At this moment, the bird suddenly awakened, and flying on to Saphir's shoulder, which it never afterwards left, began fondling him as well as a bird can do. The fairy told Serpentine that she was quite satisfied with her conduct, and made herself very agreeable to Saphir, whom she presented to the lady she had brought with her, explaining that the lady was no other than his Aunt Eglantine, widow of Diamantino. Then they all fell into each other's arms, till the fairy mounted her chariot, placed Eglantine by her side, and Saphir and Serpentine on the front seat. She also sent a message to the prince's attendants that they might travel slowly back to the court of King Peridor, and that the beautiful bird had really been found. This matter being comfortably arranged, she started off her chariot, but in spite of the swiftness with which they flew through the air, the time passed even quicker for Saphir and Serpentine, who had so much to think about. They were still quite confused with the pleasure of seeing each other when the chariot arrived at King Peridor's palace. He had had himself carried to a room on the roof, where his nurses thought that he would die at any moment directly. The chariot drew within sight of the castle. The beautiful bird took flight and making straight for the dying king at once cured him of his sickness. Then she resumed her natural shape, and he found that the bird was no other than the Queen Constance, whom he had long believed to be dead Peridor, was rejoiced to embrace his wife and his son once more, and with the help of the fairies began to make preparations for the marriage of Sapphire and Serpentine, who turned out to be the daughter of Eglantine and Diamantino. And as much a princess as he was a prince, the people of the kingdom were delighted, and everybody lived happy and contented to the end of their lives. The Seven-Headed Serpent 9. Once upon a time, there was a king who determined to take a long voyage. He assembled his fleet and all the seamen, and set out they went straight on night and day, until they came to an island which was covered with large trees. And under every tree lay a lion. As soon as the king had landed his men, the lions all rose up together and tried to devour them. After a long battle, they managed to overcome the wild beasts. But the greater number of the men were killed. Those who remained alive now went on through the forest, and found on the other side of it a beautiful garden in which all the plants of the world flourished together. There were also in the garden 3 springs. The first flowed with silver, the second with gold, and the third with pearls. The men unbuckled their knapsacks and filled them with those precious things. In the middle of the garden they found a large lake, and when they reached the edge of it, the lake began to speak, and said to them, "What men are you, and what brings you here? Are you come to visit our king?" But they were too much frightened to answer. Then the lake said, "You do well to be afraid, for it is at your peril that you are come hither. Our king, who has 7 heads, is now asleep, but in a few minutes he will wake up and come to me to take his bath. Woe to anyone who meets him in the garden, for it is impossible to escape from him. This is what you must do. If you wish to save your lives, take off your clothes and spread them on the path which leads from here to the castle. The king will then glide over something soft which he likes very much, and he will be so pleased with that he will not devour you. He will give you some punishment, but then he will let you go." The men did as the lake advised them, and waited for a time. At noon, the earth began to quake and opened in many places, and out of the openings appeared lions, tigers, and other wild beasts, which surrounded the castle, and thousands of beasts came out of the castle, following their king, the 7-headed serpent. The serpent glided over the clothes which were spread for him, came to the lake, and asked it who had strewed those soft things on the path. The lake answered that it had been done by people who had come to do him homage. The king commanded that the men should be brought before him. They came humbly on their knees, and in a few words told him their story. Then he spoke to them with a mighty and terrible voice, and said, "Because you have dared to come here, I lay upon you the punishment. Every year you must bring me from among your people 12 youths and 12 maidens, that I may devour them. If you do not do this, I will destroy your whole nation." Then he desired one of his beasts to show the men the way out of the garden, and dismissed them. They then left the island and went back to their own country, where they related what had happened to them. Soon the time came round when the king of the beasts would expect the youths and maidens to be brought to him. The king therefore issued a proclamation, inviting 12 youths and 12 maidens to offer themselves up to save their country. And immediately many young people, far more than enough, hastened to do so. A new ship was built and set with black sails, and in it the youths and maidens who were appointed for the king of the beasts embarked and set out for his country. When they arrived there, they went at once to the lake. And this time the lions did not stir, nor did the springs flow, and neither did the lake speak. So they waited then, and it was not long before the earth quaked even more terribly than the first time. The 7-headed serpent came without his train of beasts, saw his prey waiting for him, and devoured it at one mouthful. Then the ship's crew returned home, and the same thing happened yearly until many years had passed. Now the king of this unhappy country was growing old, and so was the queen, and they had no children. One day, the queen was sitting at the window weeping bitterly, because she was childless and knew that the crown would therefore pass to strangers after the king's death. Suddenly, a little old woman appeared before her holding an apple in her hand, and said, "Why do you weep, my queen, and what makes you so unhappy?" "Alas, good mother," answered the queen, "I am unhappy, because I have no children." "Is that what vexes you?" said the old woman. "Listen to me. I am a nun from the spinning convent 10, and my mother, when she died, left me this apple. Whoever eats this apple shall have a child." The queen gave money to the old woman, and bought the apple from her. Then she peeled it, ate it, and threw the rind out of the window. And it so happened that a mare that was running loose in the court below ate up the rind. After a time, the queen had a little boy, and the mare also had a male foal. The boy and the foal grew up together, and loved each other like brothers. In course of time the king died, and so did the queen and their son, who was now 19 years old, was left alone one day. When he and his horse were talking together, the horse said to him, "Listen to me, for I love you, and wish for your good, and that of the country. If you go on every year sending 12 youths and 12 maidens to the king of the beasts, your country will very soon be ruined. Mount upon my back. I will take you to a woman who can direct you how to kill the seven-headed serpent." Then the youth mounted his horse, who carried him far away to a mountain, which was hollow, for in its side was a great underground cavern. In the cavern sat an old woman spinning. This was the cloister of the nuns, and the old woman was the abbess. They all spent their time in spinning, and that is why the convent has this name. All round the walls of the cavern there were beds cut out of the solid rock upon which the nuns slept, and in the middle a light was burning. It was the duty of the nuns to watch the light, in turns, that it might never go out, and if any one of them let it go out, the others put her to death. As soon as the king's son saw the old abbess spinning, he threw himself at her feet and entreated her to tell him how he could kill the seven-headed serpent. She made the youth rise, embraced him, and said, "Know, my son, that it is I who sent the nun to your mother and caused you to be born, and with you the horse with whose help you will be able to free the world from the monster. I will tell you what you have to do. Load your horse with cotton and go by a secret passage which I will show you, which is hidden from the wild beasts, to the serpent's palace. You will find the king asleep upon his bed, which is all hung round with bells. And over his bed you will see a sword hanging. With this sword only it is possible to kill the serpent, because even if its blade breaks, a new one will grow again for every head the monster has. Thus you will be able to cut off all his 7 heads. And this you must also do. In order to deceive the king, you must slip into his bedchamber very softly and stop up all the bells which are round his bed with cotton. Then take down the sword gently and quickly give the monster a blow on his tail with it. This will make him waken up, and if he catches sight of you, he will seize you, but you must quickly cut off his first head, and then wait till the next one comes up. Then strike it off also, and so go on till you have cut off all his 7 heads." The old abbess then gave the prince her blessing, and he set out upon his enterprise. Arrived at the serpent's castle by following the secret passage which she had shown him, and by carefully attending to all her directions, he happily succeeded in killing the monster. As soon as the wild beasts heard of their king's death, they all hastened to the castle, but the youth had long since mounted his horse and was already far out of their reach. They pursued him as fast as they could, but they found it impossible to overtake him, and he reached home in safety. Thus he freed his country from this terrible oppression. The Grateful Beasts 11. There was once upon a time a man and woman who had 3 fine-looking sons, but they were so poor that they had hardly enough food for themselves, let alone their children. So the sons determined to set out into the world, and to try their luck. Before starting, their mother gave them each a loaf of bread and her blessing, and having taken a tender farewell of her and their father, the 3 set forth on their travels. The youngest of the 3 brothers, whose name was Furco, was a beautiful youth with a splendid figure, blue eyes, fair hair, and a complexion like milk and roses. His 2 brothers were as jealous of him as they could be, for they thought that with his good looks he would be sure to be more fortunate than they would ever be. One day all the 3 were sitting resting under a tree, for the sun was hot, and they were tired of walking. Furco fell fast asleep, but the other 2 remained awake, and the eldest said to the second brother, "What do you say to doing our brother Furco some harm? He is so beautiful that everyone takes a fancy to him, which is more than they do to us. If we could only get him out of the way, we might succeed better." "I quite agree with you," answered the second brother, "and my advice is to eat up his loaf of bread, and then to refuse to give him a bit of ours until he has promised to let us put out his eyes or break his legs." His eldest brother was delighted with this proposal, and the 2 wicked wretches seized Furco's loaf and ate it all up while the poor boy was still asleep. When he did awake, he felt very hungry and turned to eat his bread, but his brothers cried out, "You ate your loaf in your sleep, you glutton, and you may starve as long as you like, but you won't get a scrap of ours." Furco was at a loss to understand how he could have eaten in his sleep, but he said nothing and fasted all that day and the next night. But on the following morning he was so hungry that he burst into tears and implored his brothers to give him a little bit of their bread. Then the cruel creatures laughed and repeated what they had said the day before. But when Furco continued to beg and beseech them, the eldest said at last, "If you will let us put out one of your eyes and break one of your legs, then we will give you a bit of our bread." At these words poor Furco wept more bitterly than before and bore the torments of hunger till the sun was high in the heavens. Then he could stand it no longer, and he consented to allow his left eye to be put out, and his left leg to be broken when this was done. He stretched out his hand eagerly for the piece of bread, but his brothers gave him such a tiny scrap that the starving youth finished it in a moment, and besought them for a second bit. But the more Furco wept and told his brothers that he was dying of hunger, the more they laughed, and scolded him for his greed, so he endured the pangs of starvation all that day. But when night came, his endurance gave way, and he let his right eye be put out, and his right leg broken for a second piece of bread. After his brothers had thus successfully maimed and disfigured him for life, they left him groaning on the ground, and continued their journey without him. Poor Furco ate up the scrap of bread they had left him, and wept bitterly, but no one heard him or came to his help. Night came on, and the poor blind youth had no eyes to close, and could only crawl along the ground, not knowing in the least where he was going. But when the sun was once more high in the heavens, Furco felt the blazing heat scorch him, and sought for some cool, shady place to rest his aching limbs. He climbed to the top of a hill and lay down in the grass. And as he thought, under the shadow of a big tree, but it was no tree he leant against, but a gallows on which two ravens were seated, the one was saying to the other, as the weary youth lay down, "Is there anything the least wonderful or remarkable about this neighborhood?" "I should just think there was," replied the other, "many things that don't exist anywhere else in the world. There is a lake down there below us, and anyone who bathes in it, though he were at death's door, becomes sound and well on the spot. And those who wash their eyes with the dew on this hill become as sharp-sighted as the eagle, even if they have been blind from their youth." "Well," answered the first raven, "my eyes are in no want of this healing bath, for heaven be praised. They are as good as ever they were, but my wing has been very feeble and weak, ever since it was shot by an arrow many years ago, so let us fly at once to the lake that I may be restored to health and strength again." And so they flew away. Their words rejoiced Furco's heart, and he waited impatiently till evening should come, and he could rub the precious dew on his sightless eyes. At last it began to grow dusk, and the sun sank behind the mountains. Gradually it became cooler on the hill, and the grass grew wet with dew. Then Furco buried his face in the ground till his eyes were damp with dewdrops, and in a moment he saw clearer than he had ever done in his life, before the moon was shining brightly, and lighted him to the lake where he could bathe his poor broken legs. Then Furco crawled to the edge of the lake and dipped his limbs in the water. No sooner had he done so than his legs felt as sound and strong as they had been before. And Furco thanked the kind fate that had led him to the hill where he had overheard the ravens' conversation. He filled a bottle with the healing water, and then continued his journey in the best of spirits. He had not gone far before he met a wolf, who was limping disconsolately along on three legs, and who, on perceiving Furco, began to howl dismally. "My good friend," said the youth, "be of good cheer, for I can soon heal your leg." And with these words he poured some of the precious water over the wolf's paw, and in a minute the animal was springing about sound, and well on all fours. The grateful creature thanked his benefactor warmly, and promised Furco to do him a good turn if he should ever need it. Furco continued his way till he came to a plowed field. Here he noticed a little mouse creeping wearily along on its hind paws, for its front paws had both been broken in a trap. Furco felt so sorry for the little beast that he spoke to it in the most friendly manner, and washed its small paws with the healing water. In a moment the mouse was sound and whole, and after thanking the kind physician it scampered away over the plowed furrows. Furco again proceeded on his journey, but he hadn't gone far before a queen bee flew against him, trailing one wing behind her, which had been cruelly torn in two by a big bird. Furco was no less willing to help her than he had been to help the wolf and the mouse, so he poured some healing drops over the wounded wing. On the spot the queen bee was cured, and turning to Furco, she said, "I am most grateful for your kindness, and shall reward you some day." And with these words she flew away, humming gaily. Then Furco wandered on for many a long day, and at length reached a strange kingdom. Here he thought to himself, he might as well go straight to the palace, and offer his services to the king of the country, for he had heard that the king's daughter was as beautiful as the day. So he went to the royal palace, and as he entered the door the first people he saw were his two brothers who had so shamefully ill-treated him. They had managed to obtain places in the king's service, and when they recognized Furco with his eyes and legs sound and well, they were frightened to death, for they feared he would tell the king of their conduct, and that they would be hung. No sooner had Furco entered the palace than all eyes were turned on the handsome youth, and the king's daughter herself was lost in admiration, for she had never seen anyone so handsome in her life before. His brothers noticed this, and envy and jealousy were added to their fear, so much so that they determined once more to destroy him. They went to the king, and told him that Furco was a wicked magician who had come to the palace, with the intention of carrying off the princess. Then the king had Furco brought before him, and said, "You are accused of being a magician who wishes to rob me of my daughter, and I condemn you to death. But if you can fulfill 3 tasks which I shall set you to do, your life shall be spared on condition you leave the country. But if you cannot perform what I demand, you shall be hung on the nearest tree." And turning to the 2 wicked brothers, he said, "Suggest something for him to do, no matter how difficult, he must succeed in it or die." They did not think long, but replied, "Let him build, your majesty, in one day a more beautiful palace than this, and if he fails in the attempt, let him be hung." The king was pleased with this proposal, and commanded Furco to set to work on the following day. The 2 brothers were delighted, for they thought they had now got rid of Furco, for ever the poor youth himself was heartbroken, and cursed the hour he had crossed the boundary of the king's domain as he was wandering disconsolately about the meadows round the palace, wondering how he could escape being put to death. A little bee flew past, and settling on his shoulder, whispered in his ear, "What is troubling you, my kind benefactor? Can I be of any help to you? I am the bee whose wing you healed, and would like to show my gratitude in some way." Furco recognized the queen bee, and said, "Alas, how could you help me? For I have been set to do a task which no one in the whole world could do, let him be ever such a genius tomorrow. I must build a palace more beautiful than the king's, and it must be finished before evening." "Is that all?" answered the bee. "Then you may comfort yourself, for, before the sun goes down tomorrow night, a palace shall be built unlike any that king has dwelt in before. Just stay here till I come again, and tell you that it is finished." Having said this, she flew merrily away, and Furco, reassured by her words, lay down on the grass, and slept peacefully till the next morning. Early on the following day, the whole town was on its feet, and everyone wondered how, and where the stranger would build the wonderful palace. The princess alone was silent and sorrowful, and had cried all night till her pillow was wet, so much did she take the fate of the beautiful youth to heart. Furco spent the whole day in the meadows, waiting the return of the bee. And when evening was come, the queen bee flew by, and perching on his shoulder, she said, "The wonderful palace is ready, be of good cheer, and lead the king to the hill, just outside the city walls." And humming gaily, she flew away again. Furco went at once to the king, and told him the palace was finished. The whole court went out to see the wonder, and their astonishment was great at the sight, which met their eyes. A splendid palace reared itself on the hill, just outside the walls of the city, made of the most exquisite flowers that ever grew in mortal garden. The roof was all of crimson roses, the windows of lilies, the walls of white carnations, the floors of glowing auriculas, and violets, the doors of gorgeous tulips and narcissi, with sunflowers for knockers, and all round hyacinths and other sweet-smelling flowers bloomed in masses, so that the air was perfumed far and near, and enchanted all who were present. This splendid palace had been built by the grateful queen bee, who had summoned all the other bees in the kingdom to help her. The king's amazement knew no bounds, and the princess' eyes beamed with delight as she turned them from the wonderful building on the delighted Furco. But the 2 brothers had grown quite green with envy, and only declared the more that Furco was nothing but a wicked magician. The king, although he had been surprised and astonished at the way his commands had been carried out, was very vexed that the stranger should escape with his life. And turning to the 2 brothers, he said, "He has certainly accomplished the first task with the aid, no doubt, of his diabolical magic. But what shall we give him to do now? Let us make it as difficult as possible, and if he fails, he shall die." Then the eldest brother replied, "The corn has all been cut, but it has not yet been put into barns. Let the knave collect all the grain in the kingdom into one big heap before tomorrow night, and if as much as a stalk of corn is left, let him be put to death." The princess grew white with terror when she heard these words, but Furco felt much more cheerful than he had done the first time, and wandered out into the meadows again, wondering how he was to get out of the difficulty. But he could think of no way of escape. The sun sank to rest, and night came on, when a little mouse started out of the grass at Furco's feet, and said to him, "I am delighted to see you, my kind benefactor. But why are you looking so sad? Can I be of any help to you, and thus repay your great kindness to me?" Then Furco recognized the mouse, whose front paws he had healed, and replied, "Alas, how can you help me in a matter that is beyond any human power? Before tomorrow night, all the grain in the kingdom has to be gathered into one big heap, and if as much as a stalk of corn is wanting, I must pay for it with my life." "Is that all?" answered the mouse. "That needn't distress you much. Just trust in me, and before the sun sets again, you shall hear that your task is done." And with these words, the little creature scampered away into the fields. Furco, who never doubted that the mouse would be as good as its word, lay down comforted on the soft grass and slept soundly till next morning. The day passed slowly, and with the evening came the little mouse, and said, "Now, there is not a single stalk of corn left in any field, they are all collected in one big heap on the hill out there." Then Furco went joyfully to the king, and told him that all he demanded had been done, and the whole court went out to see the wonder, and were no less astonished than they had been the first time, for, in a heap higher than the king's palace, lay all the grain of the country, and not a single stalk of corn had been left behind in any of the fields. And how had all this been done? The little mouse had summoned every other mouse in the land to its help, and together they had collected all the grain in the kingdom. The king could not hide his amazement, but at the same time his wrath increased, and he was more ready than ever to believe the two brothers who kept on repeating that Furco was nothing more nor less than a wicked magician. Only the beautiful princess rejoiced over Furco's success, and looked on him with friendly glances which the youth returned. The more the cruel king gazed on the wonder before him, the more angry he became, for he could not, in the face of his promise, put the stranger to death. He turned once more to the two brothers, and said his diabolical magic has helped him again. But now what third task shall we set him to do? No matter how impossible it is, he must do it or die. The eldest answered, "Quickly let him drive all the wolves of the kingdom onto this hill before tomorrow night. If he does this, he may go free, if not, he shall be hung as you have said." At these words, the princess burst into tears, and when the king saw this, he ordered her to be shut up in a high tower and carefully guarded till the dangerous magician should either have left the kingdom or been hung on the nearest tree. Furco wandered out into the fields again and sat down on the stump of a tree, wondering what he should do next. Suddenly, a big wolf ran up to him and, standing still, said, "I am very glad to see you again, my kind benefactor. What are you thinking about all alone by yourself? If I can help you in any way, only say the word, for I would like to give you a proof of my gratitude." Furco at once recognized the wolf whose broken leg he had healed, and told him what he had to do the following day if he wished to escape with his life. "But how in the world," he added, "am I to collect all the wolves of the kingdom onto that hill over there?" "If that's all you want done," answered the wolf, "you needn't worry yourself. I'll undertake the task, and you'll hear from me again before sunset tomorrow. Keep your spirits up." And with these words he trotted quickly away. Then the youth rejoiced greatly, for now he felt that his life was safe, but he grew very sad when he thought of the beautiful princess, and that he would never see her again if he left the country. He lay down once more on the grass, and soon fell fast asleep. All the next day he spent wandering about the fields, and toward evening the wolf came running to him in a great hurry, and said, "I have collected together all the wolves in the kingdom, and they are waiting for you in the wood. Go quickly to the king, and tell him to go to the hill that he may see the wonder you have done with his own eyes. Then return at once to me, and get on my back, and I will help you to drive all the wolves together." Then Furco went straight to the palace, and told the king that he was ready to perform the third task if he would come to the hill and see it done. Furco himself returned to the fields, and mounting on the wolf's back, he rode to the wood close by. Quick as lightning the wolf flew round the wood, and in a minute many hundred wolves rose up before him, increasing in number every moment, till they could be counted by thousands. He drove them all before him onto the hill, where the king and his whole court and Furco's two brothers were standing. Only the lovely princess was not present, for she was shut up in her tower weeping bitterly. The wicked brothers stamped and foamed with rage when they saw the failure of their wicked designs, but the king was overcome by a sudden terror when he saw the enormous pack of wolves approaching nearer and nearer, and calling out to Furco, he said, "Enough, enough, we don't want any more." But the wolf on whose back Furco sat said to its rider, go on," and at the same moment many more wolves ran up the hill howling horribly and showing their white teeth. The king in his terror called out, "Stop a moment, I will give you half my kingdom if you will drive all the wolves away." But Furco pretended not to hear, and drove some more thousands before him, so that everyone quaked with horror and fear. Then the king raised his voice again, and called out, "Stop, you shall have my whole kingdom if you will only drive these wolves back to the places they came from." But the wolf kept on encouraging Furco, and said, go on," so he led the wolves on till at last they fell on the king and on the wicked brothers and ate them, and the whole court up in a moment. Then Furco went straight to the palace and set the princess free, And on the same day he married her and was crowned king of the country, and the wolves all went peacefully back to their own homes and Furco, and his bride lived for many years in peace and happiness together, and were much beloved by great and small in the land. The Giants and the Herd Boy 12. There was once upon a time a poor boy who had neither father nor mother. In order to gain a living, he looked after the sheep of a great lord day and night he spent out in the open fields, and only when it was very wet and stormy did he take refuge in a little hut on the edge of a big forest. Now one night when he was sitting on the grass beside his flocks, he heard not very far from him the sound as of some one crying. He rose up and followed the direction of the noise. To his dismay and astonishment, he found a giant lying at the entrance of the wood. He was about to run off as fast as his legs could carry him, when the giant called out, "Don't be afraid, I won't harm you, on the contrary. I will reward you handsomely if you will bind up my foot." I heard it when I was trying to root up an oak tree. The herd boy took off his shirt and bound up the giant's wounded foot with it. Then the giant rose up and said, "Now come, and I will reward you. We are going to celebrate a marriage today, and I promise you we shall have plenty of fun. Come and enjoy yourself. But in order that my brothers mayn't see you, put this band round your waist, and then you'll be invisible." With these words, he handed the herd boy belt, and walking on in front, he led him to a fountain where hundreds of giants and giantesses were assembled, preparing to hold a wedding. They danced and played different games till midnight. Then one of the giants tore up a plant by its roots, and all the giants and giantesses made themselves so thin that they disappeared into the earth through the hole made by the uprooting of the plant. The wounded giant remained behind to the last and called out, "Herd boy, where are you? Here I am, close to you," was the reply. "Touch me," said the giant, "so that you too may come with us underground." The herd boy did as he was told, and before he could have believed it possible, he found himself in a big hall where even the walls were made of pure gold. Then, to his astonishment, he saw that the hall was furnished with the tables and chairs that belonged to his master. In a few minutes, the company began to eat and drink. The banquet was a very gorgeous one, and the poor youth fell to and ate and drank lustily. When he had eaten and drunk as much as he could, he thought to himself, "Why shouldn't I put a loaf of bread in my pocket? I shall be glad of it tomorrow." So he seized a loaf when no one was looking, and stowed it away under his tunic. No sooner had he done so than the wounded giant limped up to him and whispered softly, "Herd boy, where are you?" "Here I am," replied the youth. "Then hold on to me," said the giant, "so that I may lead you up above again." So the herd boy held on to the giant, and in a few moments he found himself on the earth once more. But the giant had vanished. The herd boy returned to his sheep, and took off the invisible belt which he hid carefully in his bag. The next morning the lad felt hungry, and thought he would cut off a piece of the loaf he had carried away from the giant's wedding feast and eat it, but although he tried with all his might, he couldn't cut off the smallest piece. Then in despair he bit the loaf, and what was his astonishment when a piece of gold fell out of his mouth and rolled at his feet. He bit the bread a second and third time, and each time a piece of gold fell out of his mouth, but the bread remained untouched. The herd boy was very much delighted over his stroke of good fortune, and hiding the magic loaf in his bag, he hurried off to the nearest village to buy himself something to eat, and then returned to his sheep. Now the lord whose sheep the herd boy looked after had a very lovely daughter who always smiled and nodded to the youth when she walked with her father in his fields. For a long time, the herd boy had made up his mind to prepare a surprise for this beautiful creature on her birthday. So when the day approached, he put on his invisible belt, took a sack of gold pieces with him, and slipping into her room in the middle of the night, he placed the bag of gold beside her bed and returned to his sheep. The girl's joy was great, and so was her parents'. Next day, when they found the sack full of gold pieces, the herd boy was so pleased to think what pleasure he had given that, the next night, he placed another bag of gold beside the girl's bed. And this he continued to do for 7 nights, and the girl and her parents made up their minds that it must be a good fairy who brought the gold every night. But one night they determined to watch and see from their hiding place who the bringer of the sack of gold really was. On the 8th night, a fearful storm of wind and rain came on, while the herd boy was on his way to bring the beautiful girl another bag of gold. Then for the first time he noticed, just as he reached his master's house, that he had forgotten the belt which made him invisible. He didn't like the idea of going back to his hut in the wind and wet, so he just stepped as he was into the girl's room, laid the sack of gold beside her, and was turning to leave the room when his master confronted him and said, "You young rogue, so you were going to steal the gold that a good fairy brings every night, were you?" The herd boy was so taken aback by his words that he stood trembling before him and did not dare to explain his presence. Then his master spoke, "As you have hitherto always behaved well in my service, I will not send you to prison, but leave your place instantly, and never let me see your face again." So the herd boy went back to his hut, and taking his loaf and belt with him, he went to the nearest town. There he bought himself some fine clothes and a beautiful coach with 4 horses, hired 2 servants, and drove back to his master. You may imagine how astonished he was to see his herd boy returning to him in this manner. Then the youth told him of the piece of good luck that had befallen him, and asked him for the hand of his beautiful daughter. This was readily granted, and the two lived in peace and happiness to the end of their lives. The Invisible Prince. Once upon a time, there lived a fairy who had power over the earth, the sea, fire, and the air, and this fairy had 4 sons, the eldest who was quick and lively, with a vivid imagination. She made Lord of Fire, which was in her opinion the noblest of all the elements, to the second son, whose wisdom and prudence made amends for his being rather dull. She gave the government of the earth. The third was wild and savage and of monstrous stature. And the fairy, his mother, who was ashamed of his defects, hoped to hide them by creating him king of the seas. The youngest, who was the slave of his passions, and of a very uncertain temper, became prince of the air. Being the youngest, he was naturally his mother's favorite, but this did not blind her to his weaknesses, and she foresaw that some day he would suffer much pain through falling in love, so she thought the best thing she could do was to bring him up with a horror of women, and to her great delight she saw this dislike only increased as he grew older. From his earliest childhood, he heard nothing but stories of princes who had fallen into all sorts of troubles through love, and she drew such terrible pictures of poor little Cupid that the young man had no difficulty in believing that he was the root of all evil. All the time that this wise mother could spare from filling her son with hatred for all womankind, she passed in giving him a love of the pleasures of the chase, which henceforth became his chief joy. For his amusement, she had made a new forest, planted with the most splendid trees, and turned loose in it every animal that could be found in any of the 4 quarters of the globe. In the midst of this forest, she built a palace which had not its equal for beauty in the whole world, and then she considered that she had done enough to make any prince happy. Now it is all very well to abuse the god of love, but a man cannot struggle against his fate in his secret heart. The prince got tired of his mother's constant talk on this subject, and when one day she quitted the palace to attend to some business, begging him never to go beyond the grounds, he at once jumped at the chance of disobeying her. Left to himself, the prince soon forgot the wise counsels of his mother, and feeling very much bored with his own company, he ordered some of the spirits of the air to carry him to the court of a neighboring sovereign. This kingdom was situated in the island of Roses, where the climate is so delicious that the grass is always green, and the flowers always sweet. The waves, instead of beating on the rocks, seemed to die gently on the shore. Clusters of golden bushes covered the land, and the vines were bent low with grapes. The king of this island had a daughter named Rosalie, who was more lovely than any girl in the whole world. No sooner had the eyes of the prince of the air rested on her than he forgot all the terrible woes which had been prophesied to him ever since he was born. For in one single moment, the plans of years are often upset. He instantly began to think how best to make himself happy, and the shortest way that occurred to him was to have Rosalie carried off by his attendant spirits. It is easy to imagine the feelings of the king when he found that his daughter had vanished. He wept her loss night and day, and his only comfort was to talk over it with a young and unknown prince who had just arrived at the court. Alas, he did not know what a deep interest the stranger had in Rosalie, for he too had seen her, and had fallen a victim to her charms. One day the king, more sorrowful than usual, was walking sadly along the seashore, when after a long silence, the unknown prince, who was his only companion, suddenly spoke. "There is no evil without a remedy," he said to the unhappy father, "and if you will promise me your daughter in marriage, I will undertake to bring her back to you." "You are trying to soothe me by vain promises," answered the king. "Did I not see her caught up into the air, in spite of cries, which would have softened the heart of anyone, but the barbarian who has robbed me of her? The unfortunate girl is pining away in some unknown land, where perhaps no foot of man has ever trod, and I shall see her no more. But go, generous stranger, bring back Rosalie if you can, and live happy with her ever after in this country of which I now declare you heir." Although the stranger's name and rank were unknown to Rosalie's father, he was really the son of the king of the Golden Isle, which had for capital a city that extended from one sea to another. The walls, washed by the quiet waters, were covered with gold, which made one think of the yellow sands. Above them was a rampart of orange and lemon trees, and all the streets were paved with gold. The king of this beautiful island had one son for whom a life of adventure had been foretold at his birth. This so frightened his father and mother that in order to comfort them, a fairy who happened to be present at the time produced a little pebble which she told them to keep for the prince till he grew up, as by putting it in his mouth, he would become invisible as long as he did not try to speak, for, if he did, the stone would lose all its virtue in this way. The good fairy hoped that the prince would be protected against all dangers. No sooner did the prince begin to grow out of boyhood than he longed to see if the other countries of the world were as splendid as the one in which he lived. So, under pretense of visiting some small islands that belonged to his father, he set out. But a frightful storm drove his ship onto unknown shores where most of his followers were put to death by the savages, and the prince himself only managed to escape by making use of his magic pebble. By this means, he passed through the midst of them unseen and wandered on till he reached the coast, where he re-embarked on board a ship. The first land he sighted was the Island of Roses, and he went at once to the court of the King Rosalie's father. The moment his eyes beheld the princess, he fell in love with her like everyone else. He had already spent several months in this condition, when the Prince of the Air whirled her away, to the grief and despair of every man on the island. But sad though everybody was, the Prince of the Golden Isle was perfectly inconsolable, and he passed both days and nights in bemoaning his loss. Alas, he cried, shall I never see my lovely princess again? Who knows where she may be, and what fairy may have her in his keeping? I am only a man, but I am strong in my love, and I will seek the whole world through till I find her. So saying, he left the court and made ready for his journey. He traveled many weary days without hearing a single word of the lost princess, till one morning, as he was walking through a thick forest, he suddenly perceived a magnificent palace standing at the end of a pine avenue, and his heart bounded to think that he might be gazing on Rosalie's prison. He hastened his steps and quickly arrived at the gate of the palace, which was formed of a single agate. The gate swung open to let him through, and he next passed successively 3 courts, surrounded by deep ditches, filled with running water, with birds of brilliant plumage flying about the banks. Everything around was rare and beautiful. But the prince scarcely raised his eyes to all these wonders. He thought only of the princess, and where he should find her, but in vain. He opened every door and searched in every corner. He neither saw Rosalie nor anyone else. At last there was no place left for him to search, but a little wood which contained in the center a sort of hall built entirely of orange trees, with 4 small rooms opening out of the corners. 3 of these were empty, except for statues and wonderful things. But in the 4th, the invisible prince caught sight of Rosalie. His joy at beholding her again was, however, somewhat lessened by seeing that the Prince of the Air was kneeling at her feet and pleading his own cause. But it was in vain that he implored her to listen. She only shook her head. No, was all she would say. You snatched me from my father, whom I loved, and all the splendor in the world can never console me. Go, I can never feel anything towards you but hate and contempt. With these words, she turned away and entered her own apartments. Unknown to herself, the invisible prince had followed her, but fearing to be discovered by the princess in the presence of others, he made up his mind to wait quietly till dark, and employed the long hours in writing a poem to the princess, which he laid on the bed beside her. This done, he thought of nothing but how best to deliver Rosalie, and he resolved to take advantage of a visit which the Prince of the Air paid every year to his mother and brothers in order to strike the blow. One day Rosalie was sitting alone in her room, thinking of her troubles, when she suddenly saw a pen get up from off the desk and begin to write all by itself on a sheet of white paper. As she did not know that it was guided by an invisible hand, she was very much astonished, and the moment that the pen had ceased to move, she instantly went over to the table, where she found some lovely verses telling her that another shared her distresses whatever they might be, and loved her with all his heart, and that he would never rest until he had delivered her from the hands of the man she hated. Thus encouraged, she told him all her story, and of the arrival of a young stranger in her father's palace, whose looks had so charmed her that, since that day, she had thought of no one else. At these words, the prince could contain himself no longer. He took the pebble from his mouth and flung himself at Rosalie's feet. When they had got over the first rapture of meeting, they began to make plans to escape from the power of the Prince of the Air. But this did not prove easy, for the magic stone would only serve for one person at a time, and in order to save Rosalie, the Prince of the Golden Isle would have to expose himself to the fury of his enemy. But Rosalie would not hear of this. No, prince, she said, since you are here, this island no longer feels a prison. Besides, you are under the protection of a fairy, who always visits your father's court at this season. Go instantly and seek her, and when she is found, implore the gift of another stone with similar powers. Once you have that, there will be no further difficulty in the way of escape. The Prince of the Air returned a few days later from his mother's palace. But the invisible prince had already set out. He had, however, entirely forgotten the road by which he had come, and lost himself for so long in the forest that, when at last he reached home, the fairy had already left, and in spite of all his grief, there was nothing for it but to wait till the fairy's next visit and allow Rosalie to suffer 3 months longer. This thought drove him to despair, and he had almost made up his mind to return to the place of her captivity, when one day as he was strolling along an alley in the woods, he saw a huge oak open its trunk, and out of it stepped two princes in earnest conversation. As our hero had the magic stone in his mouth, they imagined themselves alone, and did not lower their voices. What said one, are you always going to allow yourself to be tormented by a passion which can never end happily? And in your whole kingdom, can you find nothing else to satisfy you? What is the use, replied the other, of being prince of the gnomes, and having a mother who is queen over all the four elements, if I cannot win the love of the Princess Argentine? From the moment that I first saw her sitting in the forest surrounded by flowers, I have never ceased to think of her night and day, and although I love her, I am quite convinced that she will never care for me. You know that I have in my palace the cabinets of the years in the first great mirrors, reflect the past in the second. We contemplate the present in the third. The future can be read. It was here that I fled after I had gazed on the Princess Argentine. But instead of love, I only saw scorn and contempt. Think how great must be my devotion, when in spite of my fate I still love on. Now the Prince of the Golden Isle was enchanted with this conversation, for the Princess Argentine was his sister, and he hoped by means of her influence over the Prince of the Gnomes to obtain from his brother the release of Rosalie. So he joyfully returned to his father's palace, where he found his friend the fairy, who at once presented him with a magic pebble like his own, as may be imagined. He lost no time in setting out to deliver Rosalie, and traveled so fast that he soon arrived at the forest in the midst of which she lay a captive. But though he found the palace, he did not find Rosalie. He hunted high and low, but there was no sign of her, and his despair was so great that he was ready 1,000 times over to take his own life. At last, he remembered the conversation of the two princes about the cabinets of the years, and that if he could manage to reach the oak tree he would be certain to discover what had become of Rosalie. Happily, he soon found out the secret of the passage, and entered the cabinet of the present, where he saw reflected in the mirrors the unfortunate Rosalie sitting on the floor weeping bitterly, and surrounded with genii who never left her night or day. This sight only increased the misery of the prince, for he did not know where the castle was nor how to set about finding it. However, he resolved to seek the whole world through till he came to the right place. He began by setting sail in a favorable wind, but his bad luck followed him even on the sea. He had scarcely lost sight of the land when a violent storm arose, and after several hours of beating about, the vessel was driven on to some rocks, on which it dashed itself to bits. The prince was fortunate enough to be able to lay hold of a floating spar, and contrived to keep himself afloat, and after a long struggle with the winds and waves, he was cast upon a strange island. But what was his surprise on reaching the shore to hear sounds of the most heartrending distress, mingled with the sweetest songs which had ever charmed him. His curiosity was instantly roused, and he advanced cautiously till he saw two huge dragons guarding the gate of a wood. They were terrible indeed to look upon. Their bodies were covered with glittering scales, their curly tails extended far over the land, flames darted from their mouths and noses, and their eyes would have made the bravest shudder. But as the prince was invisible, and they did not see him, he slipped past them into the wood. He found himself at once in a labyrinth, and wandered about for a long time without meeting anyone. In fact, the only sight he saw was a circle of human hands sticking out of the ground above the wrist, each with a bracelet of gold, on which a name was written. The farther he advanced in the labyrinth, the more curious he became, till he was stopped by two corpses lying in the midst of a cypress alley, each with a scarlet cord round his neck, and a bracelet on his arm, on which were engraved their own names and those of two princesses. The invisible prince recognized these dead men as kings of two large islands near his own home, but the names of the princesses were unknown to him. He grieved for their unhappy fate, and at once proceeded to bury them. But no sooner had he laid them in their graves than their hands started up through the earth, and remained sticking up like those of their fellows. The prince went on his way thinking about this strange adventure, when suddenly at the turn of the walk, he perceived a tall man whose face was the picture of misery, holding in his hands a silken cord of the exact color of those round the necks of the dead men. A few steps further, this man came up with another as miserable to the full as he himself. They silently embraced, and then without a word passed the cords round their throats and fell dead side by side in vain. The prince rushed to their assistance and strove to undo the cord he could not loosen it, so he buried them like the others and continued his path. He felt, however, that great prudence was necessary, or he himself might become the victim of some enchantment, and he was thankful to slip past the dragons and enter a beautiful park with clear streams and sweet flowers, and a crowd of men and maidens. But he could not forget the terrible things he had seen, and hoped eagerly for a clue to the mystery. Noticing two young people talking together, he drew near thinking that he might get some explanation of what puzzled him, and so he Roman 999, "You swear," said the prince, "that you will love me till you die? But I fear your faithless heart, and I feel that I shall soon have to seek the fairy Despair, ruler of half this island. She carries off the lovers who have been cast away by their mistresses, and wish to have done with life. She places them in a labyrinth where they are condemned to walk forever with a bracelet on their arms and a cord round their necks, unless they meet another as miserable as themselves. Then the cord is pulled, and they lie where they fall till they are buried by the first passer-by. Terrible as this death would be, added the prince, it would be sweeter than life if I had lost your love." The sight of all these happy lovers only made the prince grieve the more, and he wandered along the seashore spending his days. But one day he was sitting on a rock bewailing his fate and the impossibility of leaving the island, when all in a moment the sea appeared to raise itself nearly to the skies, and the caves echoed with hideous screams. As he looked, a woman rose from the depths of the sea, flying madly before a furious giant. The cries she uttered softened the heart of the prince. He took the stone from his mouth, and, drawing his sword, he rushed after the giant, so as to give the lady time to escape. But hardly had he come within reach of the enemy, than the giant touched him with a ring that he held in his hand, and the prince remained immovable where he stood. The giant then hastily rejoined his prey, and seizing her in his arms, he plunged her into the sea. Then he sent some tritons to bind chains about the prince of the Golden Isle, and he too felt himself borne to the depths of the ocean, and without the hope of ever again seeing the princess. Now the giant whom the invisible had so rashly attacked was the lord of the sea and the third son of the queen of the elements, and he had touched the youth with a magic ring which enabled a mortal to live underwater. So the prince of the Golden Isle found, when bound in chains by the tritons, he was carried through the homes of strange monsters and past immense seaweed forests till he reached a vast sandy space surrounded by huge rocks. On the tallest of the rocks sat the giant as on a throne. "Rash mortal," said he, when the prince was dragged before him, "you have deserved death, but you shall live only to suffer more cruelly. Go and add to the number of those whom it is my pleasure to torture." At these words, the unhappy prince found himself tied to a rock, but he was not alone in his misfortunes, for all round him were chained princes and princesses, whom the giant had led captive. Indeed, it was his chief delight to create a storm in order to add to the list of his prisoners. As his hands were fastened, it was impossible for the Prince of the Golden Isle to make use of his magic stone, and he passed his nights and days dreaming of Rosalie. But at last the time came when the giant took it into his head to amuse himself by arranging fights between some of his captives. Lots were drawn, and one fell upon our prince, whose chains were immediately loosened the moment he was set free. He snatched up his stone and became invisible. The astonishment of the giant at the sudden disappearance of the prince may well be imagined. He ordered all the passages to be watched. But it was too late, for the prince had already glided between two rocks. He wandered for a long while through the forests, where he met nothing but fearful monsters. He climbed rock after rock, steered his way from tree to tree, till at length he arrived at the edge of the sea, at the foot of a mountain that he remembered to have seen in the cabinet of the present, where Rosalie was held captive. Filled with joy, he made his way to the top of the mountain, which pierced the clouds, and there he found a palace. He entered, and in the middle of a long gallery he discovered a crystal room, in the midst of which sat Rosalie, guarded night and day by genii. There was no door anywhere nor any window. At this sight the prince became more puzzled than ever, for he did not know how he was to warn Rosalie of his return, yet it broke his heart to see her weeping from dawn till dark. One day, as Rosalie was walking up and down her room, she was surprised to see that the crystal which served for a wall had grown cloudy, as if someone had breathed on it, and what was more, wherever she moved, the brightness of the crystal always became clouded. This was enough to cause the princess to suspect that her lover had returned in order to set the prince of the air's mind at rest. She began by being very gracious to him, so that, when she begged that her captivity might be a little lightened, she should not be refused. At first, the only favor she asked was to be allowed to walk for 1 hour every day up and down the long gallery. This was granted, and the invisible prince speedily took the opportunity of handing her the stone which she at once slipped into her mouth. No words can paint the fury of her captor at her disappearance. He ordered the spirits of the air to fly through all space, and to bring back Rosalie. Wherever she might be, they instantly flew off to obey his commands, and spread themselves over the whole earth. Meantime, Rosalie and the invisible prince had reached hand in hand a door of the gallery, which led through a terrace into the gardens. In silence they glided along, and thought themselves already safe, when a furious monster dashed itself by accident against Rosalie and the invisible prince, and in her fright she let go his hand. No one can speak as long as he is invisible, and besides they knew that the spirits were all around them, and at the slightest sound they would be recognized, so all they could do was to feel about in the hope that their hands might once more meet. But alas, the joy of liberty lasted. But a short time, the princess, having wandered in vain up and down the forest, stopped at last on the edge of a fountain. As she walked, she wrote on the trees, "If ever the prince my lover comes this way, let him know that it is here I dwell, and that I sit daily on the edge of this fountain, mingling my tears with its waters." These words were read by one of the genii, who repeated them to his master. The prince of the air, in his turn, making himself invisible, was led to the fountain and waited for Rosalie. When she drew near, he held out his hand, which she grasped, eagerly taking it for that of her lover. And seizing his opportunity, the prince passed a cord round her arms, and throwing off his invisibility, cried to his spirits to drag her into the lowest pit. It was at this moment that the invisible prince appeared, and at the sight of the prince of the genii mounting into the air, holding a silken cord, he guessed instantly that he was carrying off Rosalie. He felt so overwhelmed by despair that he thought for an instant of putting an end to his life. "Can I survive my misfortunes?" he cried. "I fancied I had come to an end of my troubles, and now they are worse than ever. What will become of me? Never can I discover the place where this monster will hide Rosalie." The unhappy youth had determined to let himself die, and indeed his sorrow alone was enough to kill him, when the thought that by means of the cabinets of the years he might find out where the princess was imprisoned gave him a little ray of comfort. So he continued to walk on through the forest, and after some hours he arrived at the gate of a temple, guarded by two huge lions. Being invisible, he was able to enter unharmed. In the middle of the temple was an altar on which lay a book, and behind the altar hung a great curtain. The prince approached the altar and opened the book, which contained the names of all the lovers in the world, and in it he read that Rosalie had been carried off by the prince of the air to an abyss which had no entrance except the one that lay by way of the fountain of gold. Now, as the prince had not the smallest idea where this fountain was to be found, it might be thought that he was not much nearer Rosalie than before. This was not, however, the view taken by the prince. "Though every step that I take may perhaps lead me further from her," he said to himself, "I am still thankful to know that she is alive somewhere." On leaving the temple, the invisible prince saw 6 paths lying before him, each of which led through the wood. He was hesitating which to choose, when he suddenly beheld 2 people coming towards him down the track, which lay most to his right. They turned out to be the Prince Gnome and his friend, and the sudden desire to get some news of his sister Princess Argentine caused the invisible prince to follow them and to listen to their conversation. "Do you think," the Prince Gnome was saying, "do you think that I would not break my chains if I could? I know that the Princess Argentine will never love me, yet each day I feel her dearer still. And as if this were not enough, I have the horror of feeling that she probably loves another. So I have resolved to put myself out of my pain by means of the golden fountain. A single drop of its water falling on the sand around will trace the name of my rival in her heart. I dread the test, and yet this very dread convinces me of my misfortune." It may be imagined that after listening to these words, the invisible prince followed Prince Gnome like his shadow, and after walking some time they arrived at the golden fountain. The unhappy lover stooped down with a sigh, and dipping his finger in the water let fall a drop on the sand. It instantly wrote the name of Prince Flame, his brother. The shock of this discovery was so real that Prince Gnome sank fainting into the arms of his friend. Meanwhile, the invisible prince was turning over in his mind how he could best deliver Rosalie, as since he had been touched by the giant's ring, he had the power to live in the water as well as on land. He at once dived into the fountain. He perceived in one corner a door leading into the mountain, and at the foot of the mountain was a high rock, on which was fixed an iron ring with a cord attached. The prince promptly guessed that the cord was used to chain the princess, and drew his sword and cut it. In a moment he felt the princess' hand in his, for she had always kept her magic pebble in her mouth, in spite of the prayers and entreaties of the prince of the air, to make herself visible. So hand in hand, the invisible prince and Rosalie crossed the mountain. But as the princess had no power of living underwater, she could not pass the golden fountain speechless. And invisible they clung together on the brink, trembling at the frightful tempest. The prince of the air had raised in his fury the storm had already lasted many days when tremendous heat began to make itself, felt the lightning flashed, the thunder rattled, fire bolts fell from heaven burning up the forests, and even the fields of corn in one instant, the very streams were dried up, and the prince, seizing his opportunity, carried the princess over the golden fountain. It took them a long time still to reach the Golden Isle, but at last they got there, and we may be quite sure they never wanted to leave it anymore. The Crow 13. Once upon a time, there were three princesses who were all three young and beautiful, but the youngest, although she was not fairer than the other two, was the most lovable of them all. About half a mile from the palace in which they lived there stood a castle which was uninhabited and almost a ruin, but the garden which surrounded it was a mass of blooming flowers, and in this garden the youngest princess used often to walk. One day when she was pacing to and fro under the lime trees, a black crow hopped out of a rose bush in front of her. The poor beast was all torn and bleeding, and the kind little princess was quite unhappy about it. When the crow saw this, it turned to her and said, "I am not really a black crow, but an enchanted prince, who has been doomed to spend his youth in misery. If you only liked, princess, you could save me, but you would have to say goodbye to all your own people, and come and be my constant companion in this ruined castle. There is one habitable room in it in which there is a golden bed. There you will have to live all by yourself. And don't forget that whatever you may see or hear in the night, you must not scream out, for, if you give as much as a single cry, my sufferings will be doubled." The good-natured princess at once left her home and her family, and hurried to the ruined castle, and took possession of the room with the golden bed. When night approached, she lay down, but though she shut her eyes tight, sleep would not come at midnight. She heard to her great horror someone coming along the passage, and in a minute her door was flung wide open, and a troop of strange beings entered the room. They at once proceeded to light a fire in the huge fireplace. Then they placed a great cauldron of boiling water on it. When they had done this, they approached the bed, on which the trembling girl lay, and screaming and yelling all the time they dragged her towards the cauldron. She nearly died with fright, but she never uttered a sound. Then of a sudden the cock crew, and all the evil spirits vanished. At the same moment the crow appeared and hopped all round the room with joy. It thanked the princess most heartily for her goodness, and said that its sufferings had already been greatly lessened. Now one of the princess' elder sisters, who was very inquisitive, had found out about everything, and went to pay her youngest sister a visit in the ruined castle. She implored her so urgently to let her spend the night with her in the golden bed, that at last the good-natured little princess consented. But at midnight, when the odd folk appeared, the elder sister screamed with terror, and from this time on the youngest princess insisted always on keeping watch alone. So she lived in solitude all the daytime, and at night she would have been frightened had she not been so brave. But every day the crow came and thanked her for her endurance, and assured her that his sufferings were far less than they had been. And so 2 years passed away, when one day the crow came to the princess, and said, "In another year, I shall be freed from the spell I am under at present, because then the 7 years will be over. But before I can resume my natural form, and take possession of the belongings of my forefathers, you must go out into the world, and take service as a maidservant." The young princess consented at once, and for a whole year she served as a maid, but in spite of her youth and beauty, she was very badly treated and suffered many things. One evening, when she was spinning flax, and had worked her little white hands weary, she heard a rustling beside her, and a cry of joy. Then she saw a handsome youth standing beside her, who knelt down at her feet and kissed the little weary white hands. "I am the prince," he said, "who you, in your goodness, when I was wandering about in the shape of a black crow, freed from the most awful torments. Come now to my castle with me, and let us live there happily together." So they went to the castle where they had both endured so much. But when they reached it, it was difficult to believe that it was the same, for it had all been rebuilt and done up again, and there they lived for 100 years, 100 years of joy and happiness.